Support for this episode is brought to you by the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. The deadline is approaching for the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards, honoring young changemakers who embody the value of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Up to 15 recipients from across the U.S. will receive $36,000 each for their leadership efforts to change the world. Nominate a teen today, or they can apply directly by January 8th, 2026. Learn more at dillerteenawards.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 514, The Oral Talmud, episode 0, Learning Together. Today we are thrilled to feature an episode from Judaism Unbound's family of podcasts on our flagship podcasts feed. The podcast is The Oral Talmud, hosted by our founder Dan Libenson and Benay Lappe, founder of Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva, and a beloved friend of Judaism Unbound's. Join Benay Lappe and Dan Libenson in their chevruta, their partnered study and exploration of the Talmud through the traditionally radical lens pioneered by Lappe. Together we explore key stories and practices from the Talmud as a how-to manual for reimagining Judaism after the previous version crashes. Whether you are a beginner or a longtime learner of Talmud, this podcast offers a framework to understand the Talmud more deeply from the perspective of contemporary academic study and creative reinterpretation. Without further ado, enjoy this episode of The Oral Talmud.
This is The Oral Talmud, episode 0, Learning Together. Welcome to The Oral Talmud, a co-production of Judaism Unbound and Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Benay Lappe.
The Oral Talmud is our weekly deep dive study partnership in which we try to figure out how voices from the Talmud from 1500 to 2000 years ago can help us think in new ways about Judaism today. The Talmud is the record of how Jews navigated a time of chaos and transition. And, well, that seems pretty relevant to our time. Today we're celebrating 5 years of our study partnership, known in ancient Aramaic as a chevruta, by converting our weekly video discussions into a podcast. But this first episode of the podcast is brand new, and we wanted to begin by reflecting on why we embarked on this learning journey back in the early days of the COVID pandemic. We thought it would be fun and helpful to ground new listeners in our relationship as study partners, what we each are trying to bring to one another and to you, and what has kept us coming back every week for 5 years. Near the end, we'll give you a quick taste of what most of our episodes will be like when we talk about Talmud. We'll discuss a favorite text on teachers and friendship from Pirkei Avot, a core book of early rabbinic wisdom. Each episode of the Oral Talmud has a source sheet linked in the show notes on a website called Sefaria, where you can find pretty much any Jewish text in the original and in translation. You can follow along with the text if you want, or you can just listen to our conversation. We think the show will work either way. And maybe one of these days you'll have a study partner of your own, and you can bring these texts and ideas to your chevruta as well. And now, the Oral Talmud. It's funny because a lot of our old-time viewers of this show will know that we've actually been doing a video version of this show for really, I think, on and off for the past 5 years. It started very early on during COVID, and we always meant to release it as a podcast for all kinds of reasons, knowing especially that a podcast would reach a far larger listenership. But it's technically not that easy, so we always kind of got a little bit stymied by that, and we continued doing it. But I'm so excited that now this is going to be a podcast. But I think it's a little bit of an odd form of a podcast because in a certain sense, a lot of the material that folks who have only listened to it on the podcast are going to hear has been recorded already. Like, we know that we're not going to run out of episodes for years. And that's really exciting because my big fear doing the Judaism Unbound podcast was always that we'd run out of we'd run out of ideas, we'd run out of episodes. We haven't yet, and it's been 9 years, so I'm confident that we won't either. But we know for sure that we have 4 years of material out there. So I'm so excited to share it with people in this new way.
Me too. You know, what started as something really just for me and you, and if anyone else found it interesting, great. But if not, that was okay too. I'm really gratified that some people find it interesting.
So let me just say a word for folks who are new to the Oral Talmud, which I think is going to be the vast majority of people listening to this. What is it? And hopefully you're here because you were intrigued by the title, or maybe you have heard of one of us, or probably a relative of one of us. But the idea of the oral Talmud, I want to talk about it in two ways. One is the name. What do we mean by the oral Talmud? And the second is the format of it. I'll actually start with the format first because I don't know if this is something that we innovated. I like to think that it is. It makes me feel kind of warm and fuzzy, but I think this is something that I've been calling a fishbowl chevruta. So for those who don't know, a chevruta comes from the root of a friend or partner, somebody that you're connected with. And the idea is that it's a traditional way of studying a Jewish text with a study partner, with a friend. And we're going to talk about that more. But normally a chevruta is something that happens behind closed doors. I mean, nobody else listens to it. Often you'll break up, you'll study in chevruta for a while and then come back to what's called the shiur, the larger class, and maybe you'll share a little bit out from what you studied in your chevruta. But it's very rare that somebody could visit somebody else's chevruta. And yet from the beginning, that's what this show has been. It's been a fishbowl chevruta, which I think of as we're studying together. Everybody who's been watching, now listening, is kind of right on the edge and is listening. But they're not listening because we're so wise and we're teaching them. We're really studying these texts. Sometimes we've seen them before, often not. And we're studying them for ourselves to try to understand them. And the people are there too. We haven't figured out technologically how to include their voices in this. And it might be unwieldy and it might not be a chavruta anymore. And so there would be a loss there. But they're really close. They're like over our shoulders. And we are doing it with them. And so in a sense, like, we can't hear them, but they can hear us and they can be studying along with us. I think there's something potentially powerful there that I don't know if there are any other fishbowl chavrutas in history, and certainly not that have been going on for 5 years. And so I think it's something really exciting potentially to invite people into.
And something you brought out as you were talking just now is, at least for me, is that the chevruta experience, which is generally private, is where not only the magic and the excitement and the experience of flow and all the light bulbs, where all that happens, it's actually the re-embodying, it's the reenactment. It's what the Talmud actually is there to do. It's there to reenact, and I'm a little bit preempting you on what do we mean by oral Talmud, I think, because this is the process of making this text alive, and in that interaction between the two chevrutas, creating something new. I think we've inadvertently done something quite important, which is shift the spotlight from the more public space of typical Talmud learning. You imagine the discussion with the teacher in front of the room and all the students looking at the teacher. And as I tell my students, that's not where the real thing happens. That's where you get unstuck a little bit and where you try out what happened with your chevruta. But the real magic is in the chevruta. And I love that we've made that available and accessible to people.
Yeah,
At least I hope we've done that.
yeah, and the title, the Oral Talmud, I mean, there are a number of elements to it. One is that we thought it was going to be a podcast. We always thought of it as a podcast, even though it was video. And why was it video? It had to do with that we were doing it really early on in COVID, and people were all at home, and we had this idea that people were going to be watching video a lot. And so it seemed like doing it as video would be the right thing to do at that time. But we called it the Oral Talmud in part because we always imagined it as a podcast. That's the simple reason. There's also the fact that we originally had a different title, which was Talking Talmud. And then we found out after like 2 weeks that there already was a Talmud podcast called Talking Talmud. So we changed it to the Oral Talmud. And the idea of the Oral Talmud was that the Talmud is called the Oral Torah, right? There's this idea that the Torah that we have, the Bible, is just part of a larger body of material that was given by God to the Israelites, right? And there was also the oral Torah, which was all this other stuff that wasn't written down in the Torah, and that there's all kinds of levels at which you could think about what that means exactly, some of which we've explored on this show, and you'll hear those explorations over time. But one of the ideas of it is that there was this oral material that after, thousands of years got written down, and that became the Talmud. So the Talmud is the oral Torah. And we sort of were imagining, what if in the same same way, there's this much larger body of material that's the oral Talmud, and that hasn't been written down yet, and that we're part of that tradition. I mean, I think that a lot of people say, no, that is the oral Torah, and it is, that the oral Torah continues. But it seemed cool to call this the oral Talmud.
I love the oral Talmud name. You've always helped me shift my perspective from learning this thing that is in our past to being a creator of this thing. And I do have a conception of using the Talmud to create something else, but using the Talmud to create a bigger, more effective, more truer Talmud, a manual that is going to do an even better job of doing the thing that has really been lost in the study of Talmud over the last at least several hundred years has been really exciting to me. And when we learn it, it feels like we really are surfacing a lot of new stuff and stuff that was there and hidden and really needs to be brought up and forward.
Okay, so there's a lot more to talk about in terms of this, in terms of like what this show is about and what we're trying to do here and everything, much of which I think will be revealed over the weeks and months and years ahead. And the reality is, I think part of the podcast format is that it's not for us to say, it's for the listener to say what we're doing, what it's doing for them, if anything, and hopefully it will be something. But in the meantime, I think that, people are asking, if it's not our relatives listening to the show, they're asking, who are we? Who is participating in this fishbowl chevruta? Why am I not in the fishbowl chevruta? Why are you guys in it? So maybe let's talk about how we met and who we were when we met, because I remember it really well. Like, I was the Hillel director at the time at the University of Chicago, and we had some funding for an annual program where somebody would come and kind of give an interesting lecture in memory of a previous Hillel director. And I was new to Chicago, and I didn't really know who to invite, and we didn't have that much budget, so it would have to be someone local. And I just sort of asking around, and one of my students said, actually, I had this teacher in high school who was amazing. And she's actually from Chicago, and she's just moved back to Chicago pretty recently, and you should have her. And I didn't really know much about you. I don't think the internet was quite as developed. I mean, it was hard to get information, but it seemed intriguing. And so we invited you, and you had all these, I remember you had all these like demands, like there needed to be a huge whiteboard, and we didn't have a huge whiteboard. And so we had to figure out how to put like big Post-its on the wall and everything. And anyway, so then you gave this talk, and it was what's known in the world as your crash talk. And you could say a little bit more about that if you want, but it blew me away. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a theory of these instincts that I've had all along about how Judaism isn't really working for people, but that doesn't mean that Judaism is bad. It can be reimagined, but you had a kind of a whole theory behind it. And that was the first time that I came to see your work. I think it took a few more years until we really became friends, but that was the beginning of it for me.
And I remember that very, very well. I didn't know you were new to Chicago at that time and new to that job. To me, you seemed like the man. You seemed very
The man in a good way, or in like the man, like
kind of for me, Hillel was very establishment,
yeah.
and you were the head of that. So you were the establishment, and also an obviously really smart guy. And what I remember most about that lecture was afterward, when I got the sense that it really did mean something to you and excite something for you, and that you looked at me as if I had something to say. And given that I had sort of placed you in that realm of the establishment, and you seemed so obviously, and you are so obviously so much smarter than me, it gave me a lot of confidence to know that something in what I was bringing was important. That was the sense that you gave me, that I had something important to say, and that meant a lot to me. And I think that's been an important part of our dynamic, that you are the smartest guy I know. You are, okay, I'll try not to embarrass you, but I just admire you so much. I admire the human being that you are, the mensch that you are. And I have this feeling that you think highly of me. Forget as a person, I don't know about that, but that you think that maybe I'm smart. I, I don't know. I don't want to make this all about my insecurities about my intelligence, but I'm not a scholar and I have a little bit of self-consciousness about that. But your trust in me and your belief that I have something important to say brings out things in me that I think don't come out when I'm really busy worrying that I'm not that. Anyway.
I love that you're this insecure because, like, anybody who has been part of the work that you've done over all these years thinks that you're the man, but not in the bad way. Like, the kind of like the person, right? That you're a giant. And I love that you don't see yourself that way because that's the spirit of this show is the idea that anybody can really have a voice. And I mean, I think you're a giant, but if you don't think you're a giant, then that means that you think that anybody can have a voice, right? Because if you can have a voice, then anybody can, right? And I that just gets to the spirit of what we're doing very deeply.
I love that. I feel like I'm a grasshopper, but in your eyes, I'm a giant. And that's it's a nice dynamic, I think.
There are a few things that I feel have like revolutionized my life in general and my Jewish life in particular. I mean, I've talked a lot of times about reading the book Who Wrote the Bible as something that really gave me something to hang on to in terms of remaining connected to the Bible and remaining connected to Judaism at a time in my life where I felt very alienated by it and this idea that I hadn't been exposed to before that human beings wrote the Bible and we actually have archaeological and literary evidence of who they might have been and that there was all this history that gave me when I was 17 that gave me something really important to hang on to. And I remember when I was in high school, the rabbi of the high school, I went to a religious high school in Israel. I remember when we were graduating, everybody had to sit down with the rabbi of the high school and he asked like what you were going to be doing in the future and I told him I was going to college in America and he said, "Well, I hope that you're going to find somebody there to be your chevruta who wants to study Talmud as much as you do." And at the time, I thought it was like I laughed. It was a joke to me because I didn't want to study Talmud at all. I never wanted to see it again. And I said to him, "Well, I don't think that will be a problem," by which I meant I'm not going to be studying any Talmud. And the joke is on me because I found that chevruta. It took a while. And not only that, but it wasn't that I wanted to study Talmud and found a chevruta. It was that I found a chevruta who made me want to study Talmud. And that's you. And I am incredibly grateful to you for that. And you're a giant in my eyes because Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, is a giant because he gave me the Torah and you gave me the Talmud. So I just feel incredibly grateful for this. And it's like of all the things that I think of that like bring me joy in my work life, let's say, how would I want to spend my time in my work life? Like I can't really imagine something more fun than just spending all day studying Talmud with you.
I so feel the same way. I think we're so lucky. There's something about our approach to the tradition and to life and the world that's really fundamentally very similar. I think because of my insecurities, but because of something else in you, which is not about insecurity. We're both pretty open and excited about learning and questioning and really holding our truths lightly and really trust each other and really feel loved by each other. And I think that's a big part of what makes our chevrutah work.
Yeah, it's interesting because it goes back to like when we met. So, I said we didn't become friends till a few years later. And part of that was because I remember being so like blown away by your talk. And then I remember going out to the parking lot with you to like walk you to your car. And somehow we were talking about stuff and you just seemed like really religious to me. And like in a way that I have always rebelled against and not felt drawn to. I don't remember what it was, but like, you didn't drive on Shabbat or whatever it was. And I was like, wow, you're so open, like this theory of how Judaism changes is so amazing, and yet you're still doing it kind of the old way in a lot of ways. That was my impression. I don't know if that was true at the time or not, or you changed, but at the time, that was kind of my perception. I was like, oh, this was awesome. I really like this person. I like this perspective. But we're very different. And of course, we're very different in other ways that you were very much, building this queer yeshiva and I was straight, and so like what was that going to be? And so it just felt like, wow, this is a great experience, a great moment. And then I remember a few years later, we actually had some more funding for a different program that not just was a lecture, but now it was a weekend. And we had like 6 weekends in a year, something like that. We invited all kinds of people, and we were like brainstorming for who to invite. And one of my staff members said, "Oh, Benay Lappe, she's really great, and she's around." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, Benay Lappe, I remember her. She was really great a few years ago, and yeah, we should have her again." The students have graduated. It's different students, and I think you came back. You probably did the crash talk again. In those days, that's what you did a lot in public performances, and I was blown away again. But somehow that time we really connected, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think that it was this kind of openness, this idea that we have our commitments, and yet I think that one thing that I feel very strongly about me, and I think about you, is that I'm not afraid to hear other ideas. Like, I don't understand why you should be afraid to hear other ideas. Generally, when I hear an idea that is in conflict with mine, I actually find my mind immediately is trying to problem solve and figure out the way that it's not a conflict, which, by the way, is often a Talmudic thing that the Talmud does, is tries to say how these cases that seem contradictory aren't really contradictory. So I think that there was just something in that orientation. And I remember that we decided at that time that we should get together regularly. I probably thought like maybe once a month or something. And I think you said like, oh, I'm going to come every week to spend a few hours with you in your office. And, you live an hour away. And I was like, wow, this person really must like me, So it was kind of like, it was definitely one of those ones where, it's nice to be appreciated in both directions.
As you're talking about being wrong and changing our mind, and it occurs to me that maybe one of the reasons why it's sometimes hard to hold our truths lightly is that we're afraid that if we're wrong, if we got it wrong, people won't love us anymore. The person who sees that we got it wrong will lose respect for us, or will lose their trust in us and won't like us anymore, because maybe the thing they liked about us was our idea, or I don't know what. But with us, I don't have any question that you are going to still love me no matter what I get wrong. I used to say in Svara in the yeshiva that our origin story and the methodology and the culture came about because I only taught the people that I loved.
Mm.
And I only gathered people who I could love. And I used to always say to our teacher trainees, only teach people you can love, because you're only going to be your best self with those people. But it has only become clear to me that it's really not who I can love. It's who I can feel confident is going to love me back, even when I get it wrong, even when I mess up, even when I disappoint them. I think that's a big part of what I have with you, that you're going to still love me.
Well, it's really also helpful in thinking about our pedagogy in this show, because I think in general, for a teacher, I mean, we've both been teachers. I was a law professor for a while. I mean, we've had teaching experiences where it's not that we don't love this, we don't know the students so well. It's a huge lecture class or whatever it might be. And how do you teach with love in that way? And actually, this idea of the fishbowl chevruta may be a solution to that, because I can love you and you can love me and we can learn together. And if the person is like sitting on our shoulder, learning along with us, like in a way, they're part of that loving learning, that in a way that would be almost impossible to create any other way.
I hope that comes through. And I can't imagine that it doesn't. For me, it fills our time together. So I hope people experience that and go, oh, that's the thing I'm looking for. As my colleague Lenny Solomon always says, we're not teaching people how to be liberatory human beings or create other liberatory spaces or worlds. We are hopefully giving them an experience of liberation, an experience of being loved and being very able to hold their truths lightly. And that in and of itself, I think, changes you.
I don't think we were conscious of this, and I don't think that we've ever been conscious of it. I'm curious about your thoughts on this, but the great chevruta story in the Talmud is the story of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which we spend multiple episodes on later in this series. And famously, I mean, that's also, there's a queer level to that story, meaning that their love might have been beyond the love of learning, right? And we get deep into that. But one of the elements of it is that sort of at the end of the story, it kind of ends badly for all kinds of reasons. And Reish Lakish eventually dies, and Rabbi Yochanan is devastated. And they bring him this other chevruta to study with, who basically is always telling him that he's right. And he's like, get this person away from me. I don't want somebody to tell me that I'm right. When I would have a chavruta with Reish Lakish, he would tell me how I'm wrong. And I don't want a yes man. I want that kind of tension. And not that
Yeah, Andy says by him doing that, my Torah got sharper.
uh-huh. And
Yeah.
not that we have like a lot of tension and profound disagreement between us. But it's interesting because I almost feel like there are elements where like the fact of our chavruta is that in the sense that like I remember when we first started learning together, it wasn't you and me together. It was that I had invited you to lead some Talmud learning for my staff. I had kind of gone through it. Like I had actually had like a bad breakup with the Jewish Federation of Chicago with Hillel, and we were doing this like alternative Hillel kind of organization. You had helped me through that in all kinds of ways. And, I wanted to kind of profoundly build Jewish learning into the new organization that I was creating. And your approach had really inspired me, and I wanted you to learn with us. And you insisted on learning in this very particular way, where that involves like studying in the original Aramaic, even though none of my staff knew any Aramaic or Hebrew, and memorizing and all these things. And I was like, Benay, like, I don't think these things are important. Let's study a lot of Talmud stories, and let's just kind of give them a depth, but also a breadth of different ideas that they could study. And you said, no, we have to do it this way. And I kind of said, okay, I'm willing to go along with this as an experiment. And we studied this one particular text, and we probably spent, I don't know, months and months and months with a weekly study of this text, and finally got through it. It was like two sides of a page. And you told me I can't look up the translation at all, and I didn't. And it was an amazing experience, and everybody loved it, and everybody got so much out of it. And when it was all over, I read the English translation, and I was astonished because I realized that most of the amazing conversations that we had would not have been able to be had if we had studied it in English, because the English translation kind of resolves a lot of the ambiguities that are in the original. And that was very eye-opening to me in terms of the tension was that you had a different approach to studying Talmud than I did, and you were right. But also, I had a different approach that this show kind of allowed to give a try, which is that you had convinced me that kind of lingering and at least checking the Aramaic to see what other readings are possible is so important. And yet I also had a sense that there was something to covering more material more quickly, or that there was something in the English that would be worthwhile. And when we started thinking about doing a podcast together, I thought, like, I don't see how we could possibly do it in Aramaic and, have an audience. You kind of said, okay, I'll give that a try when COVID happened, because it was like, we got to do something. And I think that this show has actually ended up being a style of Talmud study that is new, that is in English, but it's sort of inflected with your approach.
When we started learning, I was very reluctant, and I was very orthodox about only learning in the original. I never, ever teach in translation. I refuse any invitation that asks me to teach, a 1 hour slot, and I'm going to no, get somebody else. I'm not your guy for that. I don't do a good job of that. And when you wanted to learn in English, I was like, I don't know. I don't see this being anything. But I think we've discovered something. I think we've discovered some kind of middle ground where maybe partly because you saw some value in what can happen in the opacity of the original. And I came to see that maybe because of who you are, that depth can come out even learning in translation. I don't know, but we should think about this more. We've never talked about this, but I think we're avoiding the problem of learning in translation, which is, as you were saying, is typically about it putting you as the learner in a very passive place. It also seems very finished and clear. And yes, one of the problems is it lands in its clarity on one of many possible options, but also because it isn't very stimulating. when you have a puzzle and not all the pieces are there, it draws you in to try to figure something out. And one of the things the Talmud, I think, is deliberately structured to do is to stimulate you to think and talk and interact in that very creative, figure it out kind of way. And I think we've found some kind of sweet spot where we create a very inside, thick, not too cleaned up translation in English. And we go very slowly. And I'm always looking at the original. So we're doing a little bit of a dance there. I don't know.
No, and I mean, I think listeners should understand that we have done a fair amount of working with the translation. We're not just pulling a translation off the shelf. We are
Yeah.
generally using the translation that's available on Sefaria, which is the translation. It's actually a translation of a translation because Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz wrote a Hebrew version of the Talmud where he basically translates from Aramaic into Hebrew, and then the English version translates from his Hebrew into English. That's the edition that's available on Sefaria. But we take that translation and we'll change it to try to preserve ambiguity if that's what we're trying to explore and to do other things. We're not always perfect at that, but we are making an effort to create a translation that is not just smoothing things out, that actually is one that we can have that style of learning with. And I think that that may also be part of the innovation of this show.
I think another thing that makes our learning work, even though we're learning in English, is that we are on the same page in terms of our assumption. Our main assumption is the surface meaning is not primarily what this text is here to tell you. Whatever the surface content is, which a nice translation makes it hard to avoid landing on. Do you know what I mean? A nice translation makes the surface content very prominent because your brain immediately understands it and is in that surface. But we begin learning a text with the assumption that there's something underneath there. This text is trying to do something. So I think that's an important piece of why we're able to do what the Talmud is, I think, trying to stimulate us to do, in spite of the fact that it's in English.
Yeah, and that goes to the question, I think, of what we're trying to do on this show beyond modeling Talmud study, or more than modeling, inviting you into a certain kind of Talmud study. Like, so what kind of Talmud study is it? Because there are different kinds of Talmud study, and we're doing, I think, a particular set of kinds. And that has evolved over the course of the show. So just to give folks a little bit of a taste of what's to come, in the early days of the show, and partly this was also because of COVID and because like there were opportunities and there was time in a way that there's less now. We had this thought that basically every other one, or I forget what our original thought was, we were going to have us studying a text. And our thought was that we would study a complete story in one show, and sometimes two. And we would have guests who were prominent people that we admired, that were involved in one way or another with the Talmud and that had interesting things to teach us. And over the course of time, we started to have guests less often. And we also started to linger on certain texts for much longer than one episode. And then sometimes because of getting so much out of those lingerings, we would go back to a text that we had already studied and study it again. And so there are ways that when we release these shows, we could have sort of brought those together. I think we're going to end up releasing the podcast the way that we did it on video. So sometimes there was a text that we studied twice or three times over the course of years, right? And sometimes there was a text that we studied for 10 weeks in a row. And that raises the question for me, both looking back at what we were thinking when we started, what you're going to hear over the next few weeks and months, and what we started to do over time. Did we start to study Talmud differently? Like, do you have a sense of what we're trying to do? Like, when do we know that we've gone deep enough, or when do we know that we've exhausted a particular topic? And I think that in those early days, we were just like, well, we had to do it in an hour. And so we would kind of keep things moving. And over time, I think we developed a different sensibility. I'm curious, like, how you think about that.
Yeah, well, I remember when we started, we dug out that old list that you and I created together of what we called the greatest hits of the Talmud, which we had put together as a kind of leadership curriculum for some other project we were working on years ago. Remember that?
Yep.
And those, for me, were the greatest hit texts because they were examples of the rabbis being radical innovators, even to the point of overturning Torah, which to me was a mind-blowing realization when I began learning Talmud, that the tradition isn't fixed and unchanging the way we're taught it is. And, those things that are distasteful in the tradition actually can be changed. And we don't have to either stay and suck it up or leave. And for me, that was at least phase one of the project. It was to let those who have left, essentially, and those who are in danger of leaving know that there's a third option, that they can stay and make it better. And they stand on the shoulders of very brave people just like them who did that very thing. Okay, so I think the first thing we were doing was learning those greatest hits. And those were texts that I had learned many times and taught many times. And I had a really fully formed chap on, like I had a take on all those texts. And I remember in the early days, I was kind of driving. You would turn to me at the beginning of our show and I would do the framing and I knew where we were going to go. And it was always fun and different, but basically I was trying to get this certain message. It was really clear to me across. And then we ran out of those texts. And my understanding of what happened next was partly you would bring texts that you had stumbled on in Daf Yomi.
The practice of studying one page of Talmud every day, which I've been doing for the last 5 years or so with my wife.
Or we'd be interested in a certain topic like conversion or the ordination of rabbis or leadership. And then we would look for what texts might be dealing with that somehow, which neither of us knew. Or if you knew it better, you would drive. But I think our learning has become much more open and actually much more exciting to me as we started learning texts that neither of us knew. And we were really both open to wherever it was going to take us. And I've been sort of astonished at our ability to get underneath a text in English that neither of us knew. I feel like I have trained myself to find things in text, but you have that as well. You have this intuitive ability to see what may be going on under the surface. And I feel like together we're like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge.
That's
You
not
know what?
that fell down, is it?
It is the one that fell down.
Wait, why
But
are we that?
because the important part is not that it fell down. The important part is what caused it to explode. And let's see, I don't know if I'm going to get my science right, but it has something to do with the coefficient of friction or whatever of the material with the frequency of the wind. And when those frequencies met,
Something explosive happened.
yeah, that
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
It's funny. I remember, I mean, I was joking, but in those days, I remember that people, when we would skip a week, I would get an email that said, when will Rabbi Lappe's class happen? And I was like, what am I, Jeff Liver? Like, this is not Rabbi Lappe's class. This is our chevruta. But maybe over time, I contributed more. But I was thinking, though, that maybe we could talk a little bit about queerness, because I think that we should talk about what our take is on the Talmud, because it's not just two people studying Talmud. And it's not just two people studying Talmud who fundamentally are seeing what the rabbis were doing as radical, right? I mean, our basic idea is that the rabbis were reinventing Judaism, and they weren't just interpreting it as is often framed in terms of what the Talmud's doing, right? The Talmud is often framed as the Mishnah as an interpretation or a commentary on the Torah, and the Gemara, which is the main part of the Talmud, is a commentary on the Mishnah, and it's this unbroken chain of commentating and nothing new, nothing to see here, just keep moving along. It's an unbroken chain of tradition. And we're reading it with a take that says, no, what the Mishnah is a radical rewriting of Judaism, and what the Gemara is a radical rewriting of that Judaism that includes an attempt to try to tie the two together, the old Judaism and the new Judaism, but it's still radical in its own way, and it's revealing that. And we had wonderful guests on early in the show who are going to talk about academic scholars who talk about the theory of that. But I think that the queerness element